Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C. The Kiev fascist regime is disintegrating before your eyes. That was pointed up on Wednesday when the scant military forces, a bunch of poor, underfed, cold, hungry draftees, apparently, in some light tanks from the Ukrainian army, tried to launch an attack in eastern Ukraine, and they were soon surrounded by townspeople, and they quit. They gave up. They threw in the towel, and those light tanks passed to the pro-Russian forces there in the eastern Ukraine. So this is yet another episode of the disintegration, the collapse of the state apparatus itself. And this nasty Turchinov that you've now become accustomed to seeing on TV from his podium there in the infamous Rada of Kiev, he's got nothing behind him. He's a sawdust Mussolini. He's making threats, but there's nothing to back it up. Sawdust Caesar was the original. He's a sawdust Mussolini, many steps down, or maybe he's a sawdust Codrianu or something like this to get it closer to where he is. Now, we're going to talk about the economic reasons for this. It's uncanny how this stuff is going. The uncanny part is that in 1918, it was the looting of Ukraine by its own sponsors. That is to say, the German General Staff of Hindenburg and Ludendorff that drove the Ukrainian population into the arms of Moscow. In those days, it was Lenin and Trotsky ruling in Moscow. Communists though they were, the Ukrainian peasants said, let's go with them. These guys have got to be better than the Rada or the British-French puppet, Skoropadsky. And you remember the name suggests that he's going to fall soon, and soon fall he did. But this time around, it's the Troika, the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, and the EU Commish, meaning the Portuguese neo-fascist Barroso and Olli Rehn, from Finland. Finland, of course, a country that was closely allied with Hitler. And we'll have some connections also on Denmark, the dirt in the recent history of Denmark that we see represented today by Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Yes, that's his name. We'll have some puns about that on the Twitter feed. But let's try to catch up with these recent events. The big picture is that we've just had a Geneva meeting, a conference in Geneva, among Skull and Bones Kerry, taking time off from celebrating his 50 years since he was tapped for the infamous Skull and Bones Society. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov was there, a man of character and an intellectual worthy of note. Again, superior morally, intellectually, humanly, far superior to the imperialists he was surrounded with. So Kerry, Lavrov, Baroness Ashton, remember the woman who was so dumb and so ill-prepared that she had to do her confirmation hearing to the EU Commish twice to try to retrieve her failure the first time around. And this guy, Deschizia, yes, that's his name. I'm sorry, I'm not indulging any profanity here, but Deschizia for Ukraine. You can see the wonderful public relations sense of these characters in Kiev. Anyway, they met and they came up with this roadmap document, which is primarily what can we say? It's a fig leaf for many things. But the principal idea is that the illegal armed groups should stand down, okay, and that those occupying public buildings should disencumber. They should leave those public buildings and restore them to the rightful occupants or owners, and that those seem to be the main points that the world, the Western media are paying attention to. But of course, this is an agreement that regards all of Ukraine. All. It's not just eastern Ukraine. It is not exclusively directed against the pro-Russian forces in the eastern Ukraine. It's supposed to be all of Ukraine. Today, we've had an interesting back and forth on all kinds of media here. We can take even the Associated Press and the National Public Radio news reports in the morning saying, a setback has emerged because those mean and recalcitrant pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine, they're refusing to lay down their arms and to vacate the buildings they have seized. This is an outrage. The Russians are violating, because, of course, they interpret these people as being 100% controlled by Putin, which I think 100% may be too much. Certainly there's significant influence and some control, but how much? This is a little bit harder to say. But notice, the great principle of international affairs and international law especially is reciprocity. Sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander. Turnabout is fair play. What you do to the other guy, he's allowed to do to you. So therefore, the amazing feature of the coverage here in these controlled media, where the collective hysteria against Putin and Russia is the strongest, is that they don't seem to realize that this is supposed to apply to all of Ukraine, and in particular, the right sector and the Svoboda Party. Their armed fascist Sturmabteilungen, their squadracce, their goon squads, continue to occupy the Maidan, so-called Independence Square, in Kiev. And I think they still may have a foothold or a toehold in some of these buildings. Maybe they're occupying that building that they burned out, the trade union headquarters, because, of course, these are fascists. They don't like unions. Always, whenever you find a fascist, you've got a union buster on your hands, and they qualify, right sector and the Svoboda Party. So, obviously enough, when the Associated Press, or whoever it was, called the head of the People's Republic of Donetsk out there in the pro-Russian East, he said, we are waiting to see whether the fascists of Maidan vacate the public square and whatever buildings they have and lay down their arms, and then we'll consider what we will do. In other words, reciprocity. But, of course, this concept is far too nuanced for Samantha Power or Kerry or Newland or Pyat. I'm suggested that Pyat is the U.S. ambassador to Kiev, of course. Pyat meaning 5 in Russian, probably in Ukrainian too, something similar. That might have been his fee, right? 5 rubles, right? Whatever it was, or $5 at some point. The family fee. I don't know for what. But anyway, they ignore the fact that it's got to be observed by all. And this is really interesting. One of the leaders of the People's Republic of Donetsk has pointed out, and we even have people in the street saying this, that the Kiev fascist regime, the junta, the fascist clique, is an illegal organization itself. And therefore, a literal application of the Geneva Accord would be that the Kiev fascist regime should dissolve and leave the public buildings that it has occupied, meaning all of them in Kiev. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We urge you to keep up with everything at Tarpley.net, Tarpley.net. What you have up there is an in-depth historical analysis. Most recently, this is an interview that Bonnie Faulkner of Guns and Butter out in KPFA San Francisco, but then also WBAI in New York repeats it. You can get the link to that. You can listen to that at tarpley.net. This is a comprehensive, in-depth analysis of the history of Ukraine. Ukraine is a Potemkin nation. It's an artificial state. It is not viable. It cannot survive. All of these economic discussions, and we'll get to them, revolve around the fact, which nobody seems to want to recognize, that this is an impossible proposition. There can be no independent Ukraine. Politically, I think the unity is now impossible. I don't know how federalism could even work because the mistrust is so huge. But most of all, Ukraine is totally integrated into the Russian economy, and it may not be otherwise. You could imagine some kind of a cooperative venture of the European Union, Russia, and Ukraine, but this is exactly what Barroso and Olli Rehn and the rest of them refused. And in doing that, ironically, they are repeating verbatim the analysis, the policy of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who said, we want to make sure that Ukraine is exclusively an economic colony of the German General Staff. We want to keep the Russians out and use it to keep the Russians off the Black Sea, cut off the Russians from the Balkans, and so forth. So this is now being repeated, and it's uncanny. We'll have more written about this, but you can already get the main ideas in the article that's up there, which is Metaphysical Doubt the Existence of Ukraine. Is this really a country? Who told you this is a country? It's only been there for 21 years. It's either been, it's primarily been an Orange Revolution NATO puppet state much of the time. All right, we'll get back to this in a minute. Now, I also want to point out, for any residual, what can we say, pro-working class people, you notice the people in Ukraine, East Ukraine, those are workers, railroad workers, miners, steel workers. Those are industrial production workers. That's got to stand for something. Compared to the petty bourgeois that you find on the Maidan, right? These ideologues, right? Really, very little has changed since the antics of the Ukrainian Rada in 1918 and around that time. Now, therefore, the entire government, the fascist regime that has set itself up, is totally illegal. It qualifies as an illegal armed group. It's illegal, and it claims to control an army. Now, of course, the army is melting away. The army is disappearing like the snow on a sunny day, right? It's the Frosty the Snowman divisions that they seem to have. They're going to be evaporated soon. So I think there is very little prospect of anything coming out of this Geneva conference being seriously implemented. Now, as if to cover his ignominious retreat, Mad Dog Kerry of Skull and Bones, 50 years of Skull and Bones experience. I think he's probably on the board. I don't know. Maybe that's too hot politically, but Kerry comes up with this anti-Semitic letter. Oh, what degradation. Kerry says, because the prelude to this is that the agreement, the Geneva Agreement, says that anti-Semitism should not be tolerated and ethnic hatred and so forth, but especially anti-Semitism, not tolerated. So to cover the fact that this is obviously something that the Russians wanted in there to take a hit at the Kiev fascist forces, the right sector and the Svoboda, Kerry had to come up with something to deflect that attention, right? He couldn't sign off on something attacking anti-Semitism unless he could make it look like this also applied to the pro-Russian forces. So here's what he does. He comes up with this letter, and he's got a copy of it, and he says, look, this says this was distributed in Donetsk, and it says that people of Jewish background have to register. And it also has some details. It says they have to register also because they support right sector. No, I'm sorry. There are no Jewish supporters of right sector, or very few, because right sector is the most neo-Nazi, neo-fascist, anti-Semitic bunch of gutter snipes and scum that you could imagine anywhere in the world. So Kerry comes out with this, Nuland sitting at his right hand, and Piat, the Fiverr, Ambassador Piat also says, this is the real thing. What a blamage, what shameful behavior. Within 12 hours, we had an important Jewish watchdog organization here in the U.S. Saying, well, it's a fake. This is the National Conference Supporting Jews, and their spokesman, Leslie Weiss, says that Kerry's anti-Semitic leaflet is a fake. You get the link to this. Get it on Tarpley.net through my Twitter feed. Go to Webster Tarpley Twitter feed, Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed, or just go directly to Tarpley.net, and you'll get the Twitter feed there in a box on the left. So, National Conference Supporting Jews says it's a fake. Haaretz, the sort of center-left Israeli newspaper, says it's a fake, widely seen as a fake. Haaretz even quotes Think Progress, which is the left liberals here in the U.S. Even Think Progress, according to them, say that it's a fake. And even this morning now, the consensus on the Diane Rehm show on National Pentagon Radio, or NATO Pentagon Radio, they beat around the bush a little bit, but the consensus seemed to be that it's a fake. So it's a fake. Hurry, somebody please tell Kerry, Nuland, Piat, the State Department, tell Harf, tell Psaki, tell the rest of these clowns, it's a fake. What degradation for the Secretary of State to stoop to such idiotic, such degraded, such idiotic antics. Now, we've also got the fact that Brennan, the CIA boss, the infamous Tseruchik, the infamous CIA man, went to Kiev last weekend. Apparently he was there on Friday and Saturday and Sunday. And what did he do? Well, they said, he was doing intelligence coordination. Baloney. He was telling them, boys, you're disintegrating. You better roll your tanks. And roll the tanks they did, except then the tank crews defected. We'll get Brennan some more later when we come back here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, and once again, take a look at Tarpley.net. One thing you'll find there is Obama the postmodern coup. The main thesis of Obama the postmodern coup is if you put Obama and the Democratic Party into control of the White House and the State Department, you will get a confrontation with Russia. And now you've got it. So, in terms of knowing what's going on, that book shows who knew and who knows what's going on. Obama the postmodern coup, the making of a Manchurian candidate. Now, it's also clear that Obama has been outdistanced in warmongering by others, but the structural fact is that the thing is unfolding exactly as I said. And Zbigniew Brzezinski has come out of the woodwork in his semi-retirement and is pushing various forms of anti-Russian activity. We'll remind you of the Brzezinski plan, which is discussed in Obama the Postmodern Coup, in just a minute. But now, Brennan, CIA boss Brennan, one of Obama's controllers, and remember, this is one of the guys who he wants to attack Syria. He's the warmonger. He's been denounced even by former CIA insiders. He was in Kiev, and he obviously told Turchinov and Yatsenyuk that it was time to move because their state apparatus and their military forces were dissolving. They were disintegrating before their eyes. And in order to stabilize their regime, they've got to get a conflict going. And, of course, there's a school of thought that says that the extremists, the fascists of Ukraine, would really need a huge U.S. versus Russia confrontation to get themselves on the map. They've got to be indispensable, and the worse things get, the more indispensable they might think they could become. So that's Brennan. Obviously, Brennan should be fired. Hey, Libertarian Republicans, impeach Brennan. Except they won't, because those libertarians are giving up the ghost. They've become warmongers. Let's take little Rand Paul as an example. At the beginning of all this, Rand was spouting the sort of Ron Paul stuff, right, that it's not worth it, it's none of our business. But then little Rand, on his trips to New Hampshire and Iowa, since he's running for president based on no qualifications, no achievements, maybe he can cite his membership in the No-Z or Nazi Brotherhood at Baylor University, where he is famous for molesting some woman with aqua Buddha. Little Rand noticed that the warmonger soul of the Republican Party was coming back into the ascendancy. So little Rand rapidly ran in the direction of warmongering. You have a good little article by Brent Budowski in The Hill, the Capitol Hill newspaper, is showing how the completely unprincipled demagogy of little Rand has gone from Ukraine is none of our business to we can't let Putin get away with it, and Obama, you're a bum because you're letting him get away with it. Notice he's completely unprincipled, absolutely unprincipled adventurer, and, of course, not qualified to be president in a million years. And we knew that because of his economics, but now we can see that he doesn't even believe the Ron Paul anti-war kind of stuff, right? And libertarianism for little Rand is simply it's a veneer, right? It's rube bait. It's good to attract the bumpkins. We'll talk more about bumpkins later. Now, here's, I think, what's going on behind the scenes. We have here a very prescient article in the Washington Post of yesterday, Thursday, April 17th. This is the main headline story. Ukraine austerity stokes separatism. Bailout to bring economic pain to Ukraine. Kiev's military moves in East meet resistance. Okay, but the main thing, Anthony Fayola, Donetsk. As pro-Russian militants stormed City Hall in Donetsk on Wednesday, the interim Ukrainian government was battling more than just a separatist problem. Kiev's credibility is on the line as the central government tries to persuade residents fearful of economic hardship that their future lies with Ukraine rather than Russia. So the idea here is the pro-Western government is set to initiate a shock therapy. I say again, to initiate a shock therapy of economic measures to meet the demands of an emergency bailout from the International Monetary Fund. Now remember, one of the things that made Ukraine vote 90% to split from the Soviet Union in December of 1991 was that Yeltsin had already announced he was going to go for brutal, destructive, genocidal shock therapy, which he then did. So if you were Ukrainian in 1991, leaving the Soviet Union wasn't so much leaving, the fatherland of socialism, but leaving a place that was about to be devastated by the International Monetary Fund and their austerity ghouls. So today, staying with Kiev is now putting yourself into the IMF meat grinder. And indeed, we have Ilya, quoted in the Washington Post, we don't trust those interim leaders. So here's the idea. If Turchinov and Yatsenyuk and their fascist backers, and they're fascists themselves in their own way, these are fascists in business suits, right? Fascists in double-breasted, as the Italians used to say. These two are IMF puppets. If they're going to get closer to the European Union, if they're going to get these loans, they're being told they've got to impose the IMF conditionalities. We went through them. That means double the price of natural gas for heating and for cooking. Give the entire pipeline network for free to Chevron. Give the Krivoy Rog iron and the Donetsk coal facilities, the heavy industry, give that to Ruhr Steel and Ruhr Coal of Germany. Wipe out the social safety net. No more help for old people, sick people, mothers, babies, and on, right? The elderly, nix for them. Yatsenyuk said it would be a kamikaze mission. He said it would be very unpopular, and now we're seeing how it's going to work out. The goal is to get $27 billion in loans. But notice, you get close to the EU as an EU satrapy, right? And you go through the mill. The pattern you have here is that the supposed patrons of Ukraine are only interested in looting the Ukraine, seize control of the pipelines, the coal mines, the iron and steel complex, and I would add, scoop up that Black Earth region, right? Buy up that land at bargain basement prices. Don't let the Ukrainians keep that. Take that away from them. So all of that is in the program. So because Yanukovych had gone to the IMF, but then he reneged. So people are scared. You get the idea. They quote some workers, right? Kramatorsk. This is the home of the Novokramatorsk machinery plant, a manufacturer of mining equipment heavily reliant on exports to Russia. The surviving heavy industry of eastern Ukraine sells to the Russian market. It will not be allowed to sell to the European market. The IMF is driving the Ukrainians, and especially the eastern Ukrainians, into a desire to flee Ukraine back into the Russian Federation. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So we're reviewing this very interesting article, Austerity Plans Inflaming Ukraine Separatism, Thursday, April 17th. Larry Summers had written an op-ed, which I quoted some weeks back, where he says, you gotta, don't let the technocrats impose all that austerity up front, or you're going to lose your political traction. Well, Larry, it's happening. These guys are one-trick ponies, like a crocodile, doesn't know anything but biting. Now, let's just go back, right? In this article that you can find at tarpley.net, remember that Ukraine was created in January, February 1918 by Field Marshal von Hindenburg and General Ludendorff, especially the latter, of the German General Staff. And the idea was, and this is confirmed not just by Wheeler Bennett in his book on Brest-Litovsk, but also the other landmark study, Fritz Fischer, Germany's war aims in the First World War. That's Griff nach der Weltmacht, the most celebrated history book published in Germany after World War II, which talks about the expansionist plans, especially in the east, of the imperial German government there. They confirm the same thing, that Ukraine was created by the German General Staff. Even the idea was inculcated in these prisoner of war camps. And you'll remember the goal of creating Ukraine was down payment was supposed to be 1 million tons of grain, 400 million eggs, 50,000 tons of beef. They wanted manganese, right? They wanted hemp. They wanted bacon, sugar, linseeds, all kinds of staples. That was supposed to be the idea. The Rada acted in a welter of incompetence. That would be more or less Yatsenyuk and our dear friend Turchinov today. All right, so they couldn't deliver, and therefore the Germans broke up the Rada. They arrested them, they kicked them out, and they went back to a dictatorship by a general called Skoropadsky, which was based on big landowners, latifundists, people like Cloven Bundy, I suppose, in those days. So the big estates were reassembled, and then everybody was forced to plant to the hilt because the Germans and the Austrians wanted all that bread for the harvest of 1918. Remember also that Donetsk was not a part of Ukraine at this time. The Germans said, we want that coal. You're going to extend the border of Ukraine to include Donetsk. So they really, the idea that Donetsk is a part of Ukraine, well, 100 years ago, it was in no sense a part of Ukraine, right? Not even from an administrative or other point of view. So remember now, the Wheeler-Bennett is probably the clearest on this. He says, in late 1918, a German official noted that the draconian grain requisitions of the German General Staff were, although they did not know it, driving the Ukraine back into the arms of Great Russia. And as I write here, this time it is the IMF conditionalities that are likely to impel many Ukrainians to see Moscow as preferable. The peasantry, which had turned against Bolshevism, now turned to it as protection against the looting, the exploitation, repressive domination by the Central Powers, the German General Staff. And, of course, we're also told here, the thing again is that there is no support for the Rada. The Rada were puppets of the German occupation, dependent for their very existence on their masters, who were becoming rapidly tired of their growing tendency to assert themselves. This is like today, right? The only thing holding up Turchinov and Yatsenyuk is U.S., NATO, EU, and at the same time, these fascists are saying, oh, you betrayed us. You didn't go to war for us yet, when they won't lift a finger for themselves, right? The thing that we see again and again, the Ukrainians will not fight for this government, and why should they? They won't fight for the bases, army bases, naval bases, military headquarters, logistics. They just won't fight. They won't defend their borders. They will not do it. We saw it again this week. Give it up. It's just not viable. And on the economic front, we're told that Ukraine has no way of paying for its gas. That would be solved by reintegrating large parts of it into the Russian Federation. And we're also told that if they choose to go with the European Union, the cost will be immense because they'll have to also give up their markets in Russia. So the language of economic integration is speaking perhaps the most powerfully behind the scenes. Very little covered except in this exceptional Washington Post article. Remember, the original logic of the European Union was to promote economic integration and to prevent a lot of borders and tariff barriers from Luxembourg to Belgium to Germany to France, right? Within a 100-mile radius, it's impossible, right? You can't have that many borders, right? This is the Kleinstaaterei, right? Little states, not viable in the 20th or 21st century even. So that's what they're facing over there. Now, this I think more or less sums it up. We're told that the Royal Dutch Shell is increasing their activities in Russia. They don't seem to be interested in sanctions. ExxonMobil seems to have the most extensive presence in Russia. They're also there. And we know we have these statements from German industrialists, right? Volkswagen, Siemens, I believe, and the rest of them saying, no, Merkel, no. Despite this, what do we have here? Bloomberg, the new Bloomberg Business Week, Merkel gets tough on Russia. Germany is exploring the possibilities of harsh sanctions. I don't know. I don't see it. That's political suicide for Merkel. Maybe this crisis can liberate us from this dumb cow, Merkel. Dumme Kuh. So there we go. I can't imagine this, right? The language of the German business, it cannot be to accept these sanctions. And matter of fact, the interest in sanctions by the U.S. in particular is that this destroys Germany, Italy, wrecks the European Union. It continues the same campaign that we've seen with the orchestrated speculative attack on the euro through the Greek and other tiny state bond markets. Therefore, now also we have to remember the other thing doing it. Royal Dutch Shell is in the process of doing Sakhalin 2, the world's biggest oil field development. That's way out in the Far East, right? That's right above Japan, was Japan until the end of World War II. So this is all interesting. Now, what I would say, and we'll talk about this later, if the Western powers have the folly, the incalculable folly, to pursue these economic sanctions, they will themselves destroy the edifice of globalization, which in part I would welcome. In other words, if you kick Russia out of the International Monetary Fund, kick them out of the World Trade Organization and so forth, that would be good for the world. Because Russia by itself, it has the special quality, shared by a couple of others, I guess the U.S., maybe China, of being big enough and powerful enough and important enough so that it by itself can maybe not create an international system, world system, but it can at least help to break up one that exists. And that would be a highly interesting outcome. The busting up of globalism and globalization. How about that? That's, I think, what Putin makes possible, whether he is aiming at this or not. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. It is the 18th of April, Good Friday, which we hope to address in the remaining time. We cannot do justice to Putin's 4-hour direct line question and answer. We will try to bring you some of the highlights of that next time, but just a couple of things. Putin refers to Novorossiya or Novorossiysk, and this refers to the entire south of Ukraine, of the Ukraine, as it was founded in the 18th century by Catherine the Great and Potemkin, right? We talked about this, the driving back of the Ottoman Empire, the driving back of the Khanate of the Crimea, but also this area, the so-called Pontic Steppe, the flat land on the north of the Black Sea, the Pontus in Latin. So Pontic Steppe, that entire area is Novorossiya, and this would then link the Russian territory with Lugansk, Donetsk, I think Kharkov also, with Odessa, and then on to Transdnestria, right, the part of Moldova that has decided to remain with Russia, where there are 1,200 Russian troops. Kharkov, Lugansk, Donetsk, Kherson, Nikolaev, Odessa, not part of Ukraine, says Putin. The center of that territory was Novorossiysk, so the region is called Novorossiya. Russia lost these territories for various reasons, but the people remain. They are heavily Russian. Fine. As you know, the line of this program is we don't need to follow every twist and turn of Russian public relations or propaganda. We want Russia to be strong. We want an effective balance and counterweight to the mad dog imperialists of Washington, New York, and London in the world, to contain them, to prevent them from acting out their worst impulses. That is what we need. We would like to see fascism nipped in the bud in Kiev. We don't want to have a new fascist era. We'd like to see fascism defeated. Putin does these things. And one of the themes, I think, would have to be, if you look at Putin's command of issues, detail, again, intellectually and morally, Putin is head and shoulders superior to anybody we see in the West. You remember my candidate for best head of state in the 1990s was Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia. I think now it's clear that from the aughties into the teens here, it's Putin, the most intelligent, most capable head of state in the world. I'm not wanting to denigrate anybody else, but I think there it is. All right, so that is that side of it. Oh, I also want to comment on another evil gnome. But we had Anders Aslund of Sweden, now working for Peter Peterson here, an evil gnome. Obviously hates Russia. Another one, Strobe Talbot, who was Clinton's sort of Russia expert, also hates Russia, as we see now. We ought to go back and look at those Khrushchev memoirs and see how much they were doctored to make Russia look bad. This was a theme when they came out. I don't know where that's gone, because he was the one who allegedly translated them. I think he made the Russian military look pretty bad in some of those areas. But we've done Aslund, we've done Strobe. Let's look at Anders Fogh Rasmussen. He's a Dane. He's from Denmark. And he was, of course, he got his job by being a toady for Mad Dog Bush the Younger, Bush 43. In 2003, the U.S. wanted European leaders who would be warmongers against Iraq, and Anders Fogh Rasmussen, right-wing politician, demagogue, was there to do that, along with not so many. Remember, Germany, France, and their friends said no. All right. What's the tradition? Oh, I would say the tradition for Anders Fogh Rasmussen are people that you may not know. They are the political leaders of Denmark in 1940. This is Operation Weser-Übung. Weser-Übung was Hitler's attack when he rolled over Denmark in about 3 hours. You had a faction fight. There was General Pryor, the army chief, who wanted to fight the Nazis, as the Norwegians did at the same time. But Pryor was overruled by Prime Minister Thorvald Stauning, Stauning, and Foreign Minister Edvard Munch. I'm reading to you from William Shirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, page 698. And the upshot was that although Denmark could have resisted, at least for a while, they chose not to. And here's what Shirer writes. For nearly 4 years, this means until 1944, 4 years, for 4 years, until the tide of the war had changed, the Danish king and his people offered very little trouble to the Germans. Denmark became known among the Nazis as the, quote, model protectorate, unquote. The monarch and the parliament and the courts didn't do anything much to interfere with the German occupation. The Danes, later than most of the other conquered peoples, finally came to the realization that further, quote, loyal cooperation, unquote, with the Nazis, as they called it, with their Teutonic tyrants, whose brutality increased with the years and the worsening fortunes of war, that such loyal cooperation was impossible if they were to retain any shred of self-respect and honor. They also began to see that Germany might not win the war after all, and that little Denmark was not inexorably condemned, as so many had thought, to be a vassal state in Hitler's unspeakable new order. Then resistance in Denmark began, and you can go back. The Washington Post in 1942 published a picture of King Christian of Denmark, and it says, a victim of the Nazi occupation, except this is a joke. This is ironic because everybody knew he was not a victim at all. As a matter of fact, Shirer has Christian welcoming the Nazi commander coming in and complimenting him, saying, once again, you Germans have really done a great job, right? You guys are militarily you're just so good. You're just so, so capable. Let's see if we can get that quote. Let's see if we can get it. Anyway, it's basically what I said, that he's impressed by the military prowess of the Wehrmacht. All right. So that's the tradition of Foch Rasmussen, and you can look on the Twitter feed. Foch U Rasmussen is up there. Please add your voice to that one. All right. Now, the other front, which compels our attention, and it's also highly, well, one more thing. Reading the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung here, right? We want to pay attention to Germany, because this is where this question of the sanctions will be won and lost. The Frankfurter Allgemeine has, in their literary magazine, their feuilleton, it's spam for world peace. And they're complaining, they're not happy. For several days, the Facebook pages of German media have been overflowing with commentaries saying that the reporting about Russia is fake and distorted. This comes from right-wing conspiracy theorists, they say. We'll just take a look at this in a minute. Back on the World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Just a brief note that the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, main reactionary newspaper in Germany, is complaining that people are putting stuff up on their Facebook page saying that they're giving false, tendentious, distorted reporting about the facts in Ukraine. One such post. Why are you systematically hyping a new world war? Systematically hyping a new world war against Russia? And why don't you report that there were last Monday in 20 German cities anti-war and sort of pro-Russian demonstrations? How come you suppress that news? So the FOTS freaks out about that. Right? This is in the literary magazine or the book review or whatever you want to call it, feuilleton. So Syria, this would have been the lead if it hadn't been for the greater crisis in Ukraine, right, which ultimately has the question of the new world war with nuclear weapons, as some have pointed out. It would have been the fact that Homs, the so-called birthplace of the Syrian, I would call it destabilization, right, the debut of the death squads, that in Homs is now in the process of being liberated. The death squads are being systematically driven out. Let's just summarize some of the stuff from the Washington Post of the April 17th. Syrian army raising pressure on rebel strongholds in Homs. Well, I think that understates it. Many fighters, meaning terrorists, but not all, look for a way out. Opposition forces cornered in city. This is a Stalingrad. This is another Stalingrad. Last year, not so different time of year, we had Qusair. Right? We had a whole bunch of terrorists who paid the price in Qusair. This time it's Homs. As the Syrian army steps up its assault on the last rebel-held areas of Homs, those holed up inside the city say that they fear that this place, once dubbed the capital of the revolution, is close to slipping completely from their grip. Opposition figures and activists say that those remaining are now fewer than 1,000 people, the vast majority of whom are fighters, meaning terrorists. Most of them are looking for an exit strategy. They're trying to escape the encirclement, right? They're trying to break out of the pocket. But without an exit strategy, they have no choice but to dig in. And a few hardcore have vowed to fight to the end. So it's symbolic, blah, blah, blah. and here's the idea. 300 have left in the past month, according to some sources. Others say that 1,000 terrorists have skedaddled in the last month. Virtually no civilians remain. The fighters turn themselves in at a school where they wait to be cleared, and hundreds remain in detention, the activist said. Now, it'd be interesting, where do they send them, right? Do they send them back to Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who sent them in there? The opposition All for Syria news site says that 500 have surrendered since last month, and it predicted that the rebel-held areas of the city would fall within the week. The SANA, Syrian Arab News Agency, the government, says 100 have surrendered in the past 10 days. And one of the opposition activists, in other words, terrorists, says, as a result of the scarcity of cigarettes and food, and the long duration of the siege, the regime has seduced them. So only 1,000 are left. Some remain steadfast. Some of them are on a kamikaze mission. In a video posted online Tuesday, one fighter sings hauntingly of how the rebels will remain steadfast. We will keep fighting with everything that God gave us, strength, patience, so that we execute the victory. May God keep us on our feet. Well, I don't think that is realistic. So, hats off to Syrian Arab Army. Hats off to Hezbollah. I'm sorry. Hats off to those who have helped to liberate humanity of this particular plague, right? The terrorists of Homs. So we've got the U.S. foreign policy based on fascists in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and based on Al-Qaeda and worse in Syria. This is thanks to Kerry, thanks to Hillary Clinton, Nuland, Piat, and with the front girls, Harf, and Saki. All right, so that's the Syrian update. There's also the fact that the rebels seem to be skedaddling, right? Jordan says that they destroyed a bunch of tanks. We had the imperialist side losing Ukrainian tanks in eastern Ukraine this week, and also the Syrian terrorist side that are being destroyed by the Jordanians. And the Syrian government says those are not their tanks; those are rebels that are fleeing. Okay, now let's go on here. Let's look at some domestic economics. There is this question now of the Medicaid expansion. And the way that it works is, under the old Medicaid, there is an upper limit to how much money you can be earning or have. And then there's a gap between the old Medicaid and Obamacare. And that gap has continued thanks to the rats cabal in the Supreme Court. Roberts, Alito, Thomas, and Scalia, the rats, joined by Kennedy, who, when they admitted that Obamacare was legal and constitutional, also opened up this escape clause for fascist governors, people like Walker or Scott, others. Not even all the fascists took it, right? Kasich was smart enough, thinking he might get reelected, to try to. He went with the Medicaid expansion. The expansion means that the upper limit for being on Medicare is brought up to the lower limit of the Obamacare. And, of course, the reason for this is that the private insurance companies that are the basis of Obamacare, and this is the principal objection to Obamacare, that they won't go that low, right? There's no money to be made on people that are that poor. The government should step in, which indicates to me that the government ought to do the whole thing, Medicare for all, or single payer, as some people call it. But here it is. Thanks to the rats cabal, here's what we have. There's a group of people whose income is too high for the old-fashioned, unexpanded Medicaid and too low for Obamacare. What happens to them? Well, we've just had the case of a Florida woman. This account could be interested to read. It is a very sad thing at this point. A woman in Florida died she collapsed while she was trying to sell vacuum cleaners door to door because she couldn't get the Medicaid. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So we're talking about a tragic case of this woman in Florida, Charlene Dill, 32 years old, 3 children, collapsed while she was trying to sell vacuum cleaners door to door because she did not qualify for the Medicaid. She was in the donut hole between the upper limit of Medicaid unexpanded and the lower limit of Obamacare. And this is because the fascist Governor Scott, who with this, I think, has got himself a trip to Nuremberg to answer for this, she died because of the non-expansion of Medicaid. I would say the non-expansion of Medicaid should have a new name, and it should be murder. And this should be applied to the Republicans in Richmond, Virginia. We just had Governor McAuliffe, is saying that he went to Price Waterhouse. They certified that there would be no cost to Virginia for at least 8 years, that all kinds of people could be saved, but the Republicans in the House, the lower house of the Virginia state legislature, won't go along with this. This is now going to become a set-piece battle. All the businessmen, the chambers of commerce, everybody of substance is saying, we want the Medicaid, we want all those federal dollars, and if you don't do this, the poor people are going to have to go to emergency rooms, and ultimately the taxpayer will have to pay for that at a much higher rate because you won't have any preventive care or anything else. Here, I think, is the bottom line. A group at Harvard, you'll recall, has put out a series of statistics about health care and the morbidity and mortality deriving from the lack of health insurance. So this Harvard group, in September 2009, pointed out that having 40 million people with no health insurance, and a lot of them are in Texas, I might point out, is causing 45,000 deaths per year. It's like saying 1,000 out of every million who don't have health care, it's 1,000th of the total, 45,000, will die. 45,000 is the butcher's bill, the murder account of people who say we should not have universal health care in some form, right? Obamacare being a very imperfect, very flawed step in that direction. Now, the Harvard group says that the failure to expand Medicaid upward in terms of income so that it covers the gap between the old Medicaid and the lower limit of Obamacare, that's causing 17,000 deaths in that group of quite a few million people, Charlene Dill being an example. So Scott, take note. Republicans, take note. This will not go unpunished. This will not go unnoted, whether in this world or the next. And, of course, the problem is, if you got this pre-existing condition, right, just again, you've got to be able to have everybody included, right? There cannot be this you can't get insurance if you have a pre-existing condition. That's like saying you're condemned to die. That cannot be. That is not civilization. That is barbarism. So, therefore, what are you going to do? Put out a decree that the private insurance companies have to insure everybody, no matter how sick they are. The private insurance companies will say, well, of course, we can't do that because we're private and for-profit, or maybe not for-profit, but we can't do that because the losses will be too great. So if you're going to stay with private insurance companies, then you've got to have some kind of universal mandate. And if you're going to have this law that says anybody can get treated at the emergency room, whether you've got money or not, somehow that's got to get paid for. So in this imperfect situation, right, since there's not enough power to wipe out the private insurance companies, the only thing left is something that looks like Romney Care or Obamacare or whatever it is. My hope, of course, is that this will create a powerful group of people who have a vested interest in this, and that it will only expand and not contract, and that if the insurance companies raise their premiums too high, or if they refuse to take part, They will have turned their backs on the American people, and at that point, they will be frozen out by what we should have had all along, Medicare for all. And when you hear those statistics that Obamacare is unpopular, remember that 10 or 15% of the people who don't like Obamacare, and that would be me, among others, 10 or 15% who don't like Obamacare, that is premised on we want Medicare for all. This would be a way to avoid it, because the one entity which could insure everybody from 1 minute to the next simply by transferring the information from the Social Security office to the Medicare office and making that Medicare for all, that would be Medicare. And that then could be done. $100 per person per month would, and of course, for free if you're destitute. So, the situation is therefore it. So with that, 8 million people now on Obamacare, I would say the reactionary Republicans have made a bad bet. Now, there are some places, of course, there used to be this saying in Germany that culture penetrates everywhere, but not to Pomerania. Political awareness penetrates everywhere, but I guess there are some places in the Deep South where it takes several generations. But still, I don't see the exclusive, obsessive focus on rollback Obamacare. I don't see how this is going to be a loser, provided, and this is a big proviso, that the Democrats fight. And, of course, Democrat and fight, this doesn't rhyme, hardly coexisting in the same sentence. So I think that's about the situation. Now, we got limited time left. We got to do a bunch of things. We got to talk about Cloven Bundy. Isn't it amazing how the libertarians were brought to the United States? Von Hayek was brought by David Rockefeller. Von Mises was brought by David Rockefeller. The Koch brothers and their father founded the Cato Institute. Ron Paul served as the right-wing man of the Mitt Romney campaign of Bain Capital and Wall Street. So now we've got Cloven Bundy. He's a rich rancher. He's got a helicopter. He's a multimillionaire, and he's a Mormon. And the word is, from my Mormon sources, that he's not just LDS, he's FLDS, Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. The last leader of that religious establishment or church that you've heard of, temple, I guess, is, of course, the infamous Warren Jeffs. Warren Jeffs now serving life plus 20 years for molesting, raping 12-year-old girls. And that is the question with old Cloven Bundy. I say Cloven Bundy advisedly because, of course, the cloven is generally the sign of the dark one, right? The Prince of Lies. Cloven Bundy may be filling that role for some, for sociological reasons. So he claimed, this is obviously a Mormon claim, right? Take a look at my book. Just Too Weird. Romney and the Mormon takeover of America with polygamy and the other factors, but mainly polygamy right now. Take a look at it. Just Too Weird. You can buy it through Tarpley.net. The Mormon position always is the United States is not legitimate because the United States is not the kingdom of God. And this was the case, the Mountain Meadows Massacre, right? When the Arkansas travelers, the Fancher party came through, the Mormons said, you can't take the grass, you can't take the stocks by the side of the road because those have been given by God to the Mormons. So that's essentially what Cloven Bundy is arguing. We'll get back to him in just a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Got to cram a lot into the last segment. So Cloven Bundy is fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, and there's no point in doing that unless you believe in polygamy. And we know from practice that polygamy then extends the range down to the area of the 12-year-old Lolita, and that seems to be a structural feature. So that would be the question we would have to ask about Bundy. How many girls do you have there in your establishment? Now, of course, you can't get too many people to come out with weapons and risk their lives for polygamy involving 12-year-old girls, as Warren Jeffs found out. You can get some, though. But much easier is to be, I'm anti-government, and I believe that the United States government is illegitimate, and I'm not a citizen of the United States. Be interesting if they taxed him at the rate for foreigners. I think it turns out to be higher because you don't get the exemptions and the standard deduction, right, whether he would consider himself ill-used. But in particular, we cannot have government by armed gang. That simply does not work. The same people who came out for the Browns, right, the millionaires in New Hampshire, because they thought that they should be exempt from taxes because they were sovereign individuals, they're now coming out for Cloven Bundy and his crackpot theory. And it's interesting the way that the spell check seems to turn Cliven into Cloven. Maybe there's a prophetic element in that. This is simply untenable. There's not a government of laws, right, when Cloven can get an armed gang to intimidate federal officers. Now, you haven't heard the end of this. I don't care about what use might be made of this land. It's public land. I'm not interested. But I am interested in the precedent of government by armed gang, because that government by armed gang in the service of big landowners is called fascism. That's what the Nazi Party looked like east of the Elbe, the East Elbian Junkers, the big landowners. Right? Von Hindenburg was notably one of them. This is not conservative. It's radical. Now, even you look at Glenn Beck, the Mormon, right? I think he's afraid because if this goes too far, what has been covered up so far, that is Cloven is a Mormon, that's going to be exposed. And then Glenn Beck is telling people, back off, don't make this guy the hero. The people that have embraced him, Hucksterby, right? The former governor of Arkansas, Hucksterby, and little Rand Paul, have gotten close to endorsing Cloven Bundy. I would say they are doomed. They are doomed. And anybody who thinks that a revolution comes about when a bunch of useful idiots and dupes go out and risk their lives for a latifundist, for a neo-feudal character, well, that's not the American Revolution. All right, now we have, unfortunately, the obituaries here for Mike Rupert and John Judge. Rupert always said he came from a CIA family. He played as a child in the inner courtyard of the Pentagon. He did give lectures about 9/11 in 2001, 2002. These had some significance, but this was never the main issue for him. He was always more interested in peak oil. Therefore, he was more interested in Malthusianism, Darwinism, including social Darwinism, and ultimately Rousseau. If you see him with the Indians wearing feathers and so forth, he's looking for the noble savage. He wants to become the noble savage. Very early on, Rupert included a theme which he called ethical population reduction. And I'm afraid I have to condemn that without any reservations. That is code word for genocide, and as time went on, the apocalypse, the collapse, the end of the world, all of these elements became greater and greater. Essentially, he chose the path of philosophical despair. He seems to have chosen the idea that the material universe is evil, and then drew the final consequences by killing himself, if that's what happened. So a tragic story, but it seems to me the lesson of it is don't embrace Malthusianism, social Darwinism, and Rousseau. You get into a block universe, you get into a situation where the human condition is truly tragic and hopeless. A couple of specifics. He was always extremely militant that Gary Webb had committed suicide, and anybody who didn't agree with that was trailer park trash on the Internet. I would say that doesn't follow. Where's the proof? I would say the question of Gary Webb is still very much an open one, whether the CIA was involved in that, as they might have been involved in the killing of Hastings more recently. The other problem with Rupert is you cannot write about 9/11 by putting yourself in the center of it, right? If somebody comes along and says 9/11 was ordered by Bush and Cheney to prevent me, whoever the me is, from exposing, say, Condoleezza Rice's ties to the Nazi International, that indicates an unstable mental condition. And unfortunately, this is Rupert from beginning to end. From the 1998 intervention against Deutsch, all about himself, to the crossing the Rubicon, he is present there at every point. We don't have time to do Judge. We'll talk about Judge next time. Let's just sum up. Left liberals hate Putin because Putin deprives them of their two favorite tools for reshaping human affairs, for regime change and for altering the complexion of the world. With Putin, he blocks color revolutions. He rolls back color revolutions, and he is powerful enough so that humanitarian bombing, responsibility to protect, cannot occur. The left liberals, therefore, hate Putin even more than the reactionaries. The other thing, as I said before, my hope is that out of this crisis, globalization can be broken up. The real name of the U.S. world domination, uncontested world domination from 1991 or thereabouts until 2014, or 2013, 2014, is globalization. The sanctions will end it. The nations will remain. That's quite interesting. Now, lastly, and apologizing for the short time, it is Easter. It's Easter Sunday. Today is Good Friday. We had Maundy Thursday yesterday with the Pope washing the feet of the poor and the excluded in San Giovanni Laterano in Rome. Today we just watched the Mass of the Lord's Passion with a Franciscan who was quoting Dante. He was quoting some lines from Dante and referred also to Paul Claudel and other interesting literary sources. I would recommend in sacred music, you have the famous text, Stabat Mater Dolorosa, right? The Virgin Mary standing at the foot of the cross. There are versions by Pergolesi, by other classical composers. I would urge people to take a look at those. And remember, the significance of Easter is simply this. The Nirvana religions or the Manichaeans or other systems are, and indeed Lutheranism in some ways, all of these go with the idea that the material universe is somehow evil. And as I say, I think Rupert ultimately got himself to a situation where he felt that the material universe was evil. And the answer to that is then you leave it. But the question of Christ is, if God is willing to come into the world, the philosophical significance of this is that the material universe is therefore not necessarily evil. It can, of course, be evil, but that is not a metaphysical status of evil. That is generally the product of human free will being misused. So the universe, the physical universe, is not evil. It can therefore be improved. In other words, economic progress, science, technology, industry, agriculture, all of these can be used to improve and to accentuate the potential good of the material universe. Now, the Gnostics or Gnostics say, no, this is wrong. The material universe is evil. We even had a couple of years ago, as I've cited, a study that said Judas Iscariot was a guy who was actually a friend of Christ. He wanted Christ to realize that coming into the world was a terrible mistake. Well, no. The fact is, material universe is susceptible to improvement. It doesn't have to be evil. It can be good. And God loves the world. And remember the main message of Easter. Peace. World peace is the principal message of Easter, and that's worth living by. See you next week on World Crisis Radio.